Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We are dealing with the death of Jesus in Matthew chapter 27 and looking at the amazing events in the hours just before he dies. The Sanhedrin and the people and the two men who are dying with him all taunt him. And the final taunt that they give is in verse 43. And this would come mostly from the Sanhedrin. He puts his trust in God. Now let God rescue him if he wants him. He did say, I am the Son of God. Now, those words have come almost straight out of Wisdom chapter 2, which I shared with you many episodes back. And they don't realize that Jesus is experiencing Psalm 22 and Wisdom chapter 2 as they are looking at him. That he has to trust God against all that is coming against him, against all the taunts, against all the insults. He's got to trust God beyond reason. And that is what he's teaching us here. That no matter what is thrown at you, trust God beyond reason. God alone knows what he's doing. These other people didn't seem to have any idea what God was actually doing at the time. Jesus had told them ahead of time that he would give them the sign of Jonah. And this was the beginning of the sign of Jonah. Some of them would recognize the rest of the sign after his resurrection, but right now everything was in darkness. And you can see from the way that people are responding to Jesus that they've gone into physical darkness and spiritual darkness as well. I'll bring that up in a moment for you. But we need to just realize that the words of the Song of Songs, chapter 8, verse 6, are being lived by Jesus, that love is as strong as death, and love is as terrible as Sheol. That means that as great as the hatred of hell is, love is matching it absolutely, line by line and syllable by syllable. It's being matched, and hell is actually being cancelled out. So all of hell has to be thrown at Jesus for Jesus to actually cancel it out. So he takes it into himself and he kills all that hatred and all that revenge and all that evil that is coming at him. He kills it in himself. And out of him, once his heart is opened, will flow rivers of living water to absolutely everybody. To say that this is heroic is language that is not big enough. Heroism is just a word that human beings use about human beings. This is way above that, absolutely way above that. But they don't realize that this is a contest between heaven and hell, love and hate, God and Satan, and that hell will be closed once this is finished, that Jesus is actually filling in all the dots, and he is saying that love is greater than anything else. Now, they want him to show power. They just have to wait a couple of days and they will see power that is greater than death, power that is greater than hell, power that is greater than everybody. And they will also meet a Jesus whom they can no longer touch or destroy. They will no longer be able to attack in any way because they will see him coming in power on the clouds of heaven, as he has said. Okay. And Jesus must persevere, therefore, because if he perseveres, the whole era of redemption will happen for the whole world, and the rivers of living water will flow out to the ends of the earth. But Matthew now tells us something that's actually terribly important, and most of us just read it and move on. I want to show you just how important it is. He says in verse 45, from the 6th hour, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at about the 9th hour, that's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you deserted me? Then the Sanhedrin kick in and they said, oh, he's calling upon Elijah. Now the difference between Eli and Eliyahu is amazing. We'll come to that bit later. Let's deal with the darkness first. The darkness is actually terribly important. First of all, if there was darkness over the whole land for 3 hours, you are not talking about an eclipse of the sun, because an eclipse of the sun lasts about 5 minutes. You are looking at a cosmic event that is coming from God and carries a huge message. One message for Jesus and another message for the whole land. We'll deal with the message for Jesus first. First of all, let me give you a little bit of background. If you go back into Genesis chapter 3, where Adam, in the name of the whole human race, rebelled against God. And after his rebellion, he was plunged into spiritual darkness. And all the terrible things that has come out of that terrible spiritual darkness. And that spiritual darkness signifies man's break from his sonship with God, man's break with the will of God, very well illustrated in the Sanhedrin here. And it was the time when God the Father had his agony in the Garden of Eden. God the Son had his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. And God the Father's agony was that this jewel of a person that he had made and wanted to increase and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it had now turned against him completely and had become a prodigal son and was going to have to live out the consequences of his decision. But Genesis 3:9 tells you that God went looking for Adam and said, Adam, where are you? Where are you? I can't see you. God went looking for him in his darkness. Now you're 4,000 years later, and the second Adam here on Calvary is bringing humanity back to the Father. He has been carving a path all the way back, the narrow way of Matthew 7:13. He's been carving this road back. And here, when he is paying the price to bring these two together, that is God and humanity, the Creator and his creatures, to bring them back into unity and love and into one will. Just at this crucial moment, he's plunged into darkness. And you have to ask, why? There's a whole lot of answers to the why. So he has 3 hours of darkness before his death. The first answer to that is, this is the 14th day of Nisan. That is March, April for us. And the temperature in the middle of the day in Israel would have been about 28 degrees centigrade. That would literally cook his wounds. It would be an added terrifying torture. But God's will is in all of his creation. The only part of his creation that rebelled against him was man, because we were given free will, we could choose otherwise. And so the sun refuses to torture its creator and withdraws. It's a cosmic event, something that we don't look at all. We don't see the significance of it. But as a result of the sun withdrawing its light, it will not torture its creator. The result of that is that the temperature goes down and Jesus is now wrapped in a cool blanket of darkness. Now, I want you to see that this is the tenderness of the Father for his beloved Son. His beloved Son has agreed to pay this terrible price for the redemption of humanity. But some things are not actually necessary, and the torture of the Son wasn't actually necessary. So he clothed his Son in this cool blanket of darkness. And Jesus immediately recognizes the Father's hand in this. And in this cool blanket of darkness, Jesus cries out to him, a little bit like a small boy in a nightmare, shouting for his daddy, saying, where are you? I can't see you. It's all dark. It's all terrible. And the dad walks into the child's bedroom, puts a blanket around the child, takes him out of the place altogether into a place of security. Matthew says, as soon as this 3 hours were up, the Father just snatched his Son into heaven. It's something we don't look at, but something we need to look at. We really need to look at. Because back there in Genesis, the Father went looking for his Son. Now here on the cross, the Son is looking for his Father. And so you have the journey of the human race completed. You have Jesus making the connection. You have him bridging the chasm that existed between God and man. And this is incredibly important, much more important than the time I can give to you, to saying it to you. The other thing that the darkness does for Jesus is that it gives him the privacy to die. Now, this is a very delicate move on the part of the Father. Jesus is exposed to the public, and he's being taunted and insulted and humiliated right, left, and center. Nobody gives him any time out. Nobody. To die like that, even if you were not in the torture that he was in, is torture by itself. And once the Father wraps the whole thing in darkness, silence enters into Calvary. The darkness actually silences everybody except the Sanhedrin. Even God couldn't shut them up. It's incredible. But what we discover is that this darkness puts fear into the whole crowd that's actually around Calvary. They realize that this is not natural. This is not normal. This is not an eclipse of the sun. And so a salutary fear enters into them, which is very good. Now, St. Luke picks this up and tells you that the people went home beating their breasts after this. That means they really realized they had really offended God. Matthew won't give you that detail. But Matthew wants you to delve into the darkness to know just what's going on. The Roman soldiers went into silence. So they would stop playing their games. They normally just played games at the foot of any crucifixion they were doing, because a crucifixion for them is just part of their job. They stopped. The next time they speak, they will declare that man a son of God. They look on in absolute awe that no matter what is thrown at him, from heaven or from earth or from hell, he can take it. You're looking at a hero from every angle. For the Roman soldiers to admire somebody they killed is off the Richter scale. It just didn't happen. And for the man who actually pierced him with the lance, which Matthew's not going to tell you, to become his disciple, just tells you that what was going on Calvary was absolutely massive. And no matter how blind they were, they had to see something. They had to see the heroism of this man. Nothing, only love came out of him. Nothing. He was love incarnate. Nothing, only wisdom came out of him. He was wisdom incarnate. Nothing, only life came out of him, because he was life. But that's not the only message. Matthew says that the darkness covered the whole land of Israel. Now, the message for the land of Israel and the message for Jesus would be very, very different. Very different. And to understand the message for the land of Israel, you've got to go back to the book of Exodus and chapter 10. And there in the book of Exodus, Moses prayed to God, and God sent 3 days of darkness onto the whole land of Egypt. And the whole land of Egypt really suffered. Now, Israel only get 3 hours. They got 3 days. And they had to understand that if God had visited them with 3 days of terrible darkness, and the book of Exodus says it was a darkness that was so thick you could actually touch it. Well, that's not the absence of light, it's the presence of evil. And so the people of Israel are being told, the light of the world visited you, you rejected it. Now know what you have chosen. You have chosen spiritual darkness. And spiritual darkness brings terrible results of sin and disintegration and chaos and wars and destruction, all of which they did experience. But know what you have chosen. You have chosen the darkness over the light. Now, the subject of light and darkness is the very first subject in the Bible, because you only go as far as verse 3 in Genesis, when you're told that God created light to dispel the darkness. And after 3.5 years of the light of God spreading all over Israel with its life and its grace and its beauty and its new life and its healing and its forgiveness and absolutely everything else, that they would choose the darkness is mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. So if they chose the darkness, then they're going to have to take the consequences. But they were warned about it. Let me just give you one of the warnings. I won't take up your time with all of them. Amos chapter 8, verses 9 to 10 says, on that day, that was the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord, which is the day they're actually having on the 14th day of Nisan in the year 30 when Jesus Christ died. This was the day of the Lord. On that day, I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight. And I will make it a morning like the morning for an only son. They were warned. But you know, blindness is blindness, and hardness of heart is hardness of heart. It's very frightening. And so the battle that's going on here is also the battle for the soul of Israel, for the soul of the nation. Who will be the shepherd and the leader of this nation? But let's go back to Jesus, because the wonderful message is for him, that the Father is now enclosing him, even though he has been plunged into this terrible darkness. You see, Jesus has to go into this hellish darkness for us to pull us out of it. So his prayer pulling us out of it is for the whole lot of us. And so Jesus is now in these 3 hours hanging over the chasm of hell, because if he doesn't make this connection between God and man, there will be nothing, only hell on earth, and earth would have long since destroyed itself. We've come very close to it in world wars, for example. So Jesus, in his prayer, we have to know who he is. He is the Holy One, but he is covered with the sins of humanity. And so in the eyes of God, he is humanity in this condition. Apparently that if you just take the description of sin and the terrifying destruction that it does to us interiorly, that if you look at Jesus on the cross, he was a perfect picture of what sin does to the soul, the utter destruction of it. And so the prayer of Jesus, Eli, Eli, it's raw anguish. It's total pain. And he's carrying the anguish and the unbelief and the suffering and the disintegration of the human race with him in that prayer, when he's crying out to God, trying to make that connection. But it's a prayer of pure faith and absolute trust in God. He trusts God beyond reason, and he wants all of us to trust God beyond reason, beyond what your eyes can see, beyond what your ears can hear, beyond what your heart can understand. Trust him, trust him. God is infinitely good. God is infinitely loving. God is infinitely merciful. I always think that on Good Friday we should dance for joy. So what we're looking at is this terrible mystery of God's rejection of sin. And somebody has got to somehow take that terrible mystery of sin and deal with it. And Jesus has to do that. So on the cross, he's interceding for us as Messiah, Savior, intercessor, Son of God. But it's a moment of triumphant grace, because Matthew tells you almost immediately that Jesus died, that the Father took him into glory. And so this moment of, I call it triumphant grace. It doesn't look triumphant because it's raw anguish and pain and distress. And we have to understand that we have the wrong image of triumph. That when we are struggling ourselves through something that is very painful and deep, and a cry comes from the very depths of our being to reach the very depths of God, that is triumphant prayer as well. And it's triumphant through his prayer. Through him, with him, and in him, we get the grace to triumph over everything. And so Jesus carries the cry of every human heart. He carries our disillusionments. He carries our doubts. He carries our everything. He carries everything and lays it at the feet of the Father, is what I should be saying. And he trusts the Father completely, and he actually makes the connection. So he becomes the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge over which we all walk into heaven. We walk over his shoulders into heaven. There he is, hanging over the abyss. Okay. Because it doesn't look like triumph, the Sanhedrin won't accept it, because they have a worldly image of what triumph is. And if we have a worldly image of what victory and triumph is, then we don't get the message either. I love the way Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, God only asks you to try. He didn't ask you to succeed. I think it's brilliant. And so the Lord wants us to deal with things, but to deal with them through him, with him, and in him. Now, while this heroism is going on in Jesus, the Sanhedrin continue to attack. How they couldn't stop, I just don't know. There seemed to have been no limit to their need to attack him. And when he cries out, Eli to God, El is God, Eli is my God, they somehow twist that into Eliyahu, which is the name Elijah. And the reason why they do it is that if they can tell the people at this last minute, because they know Jesus is about to die, if at this very last hurdle they can tell the people he's calling upon Elijah, therefore he can't be the Messiah because the Elijah comes before the Messiah, that's totally evil. It's completely malicious. How they could do it is beyond me completely. Beyond me completely. They don't seem to have any idea what's going on. At least the people are in silence at this stage, and the Roman soldiers are in silence. And it's this silence of the cross that when you go to St. John's Gospel, he picks that up because he was there, and it struck him very, very deeply that suddenly silence fell on the whole place, because these moments of the prayer of Jesus to the Father, making the connection across the chasm, was the most sacred, terrifying, and wonderful moment. Thank you for listening. Slán agus benach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Each one of us is on a journey. Some of us are on the journey of growing up. Some of us are in education. Some of us are falling in love, going to work, struggling with unemployment or ill health. We all need to have the scriptures open to us. We all need to encounter Jesus on the road. I really warmly welcome the work of Shalom World Television. Thank you for the way in which you assist in the mission of the church, helping them to come to terms with the eternal truth as it applies in their lives, whatever their journey. And I extend my blessing to you and to all your viewers, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.